Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you've ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. Since 2009, our radio program hosted guest experts from around the globe sharing their perspectives, experiences, and expertise while giving you food for thought. If you can't listen live, then download and listen to any of our 300-plus podcasts in our library at texasconflictcoach.com. So sit back, relax, or join the conversation every Tuesday evening, or tweet us at TXConflictCoach.
Well, welcome everyone. We continue our three-part series, When People, Pets, and Places Collide, with guest experts Debra Hamilton and Gary Norman. Now, in this series, we have already discussed how dispute resolution tools are used to manage the conflicts among people involving their animals, whether it is about conflict that occurs from a divorce, neighbor-to-neighbor dispute, veterinarian, dog park, or even the kennel. We also learned about how mediation and other facilitated dialogues help people progress in these difficult conversations without resorting to litigation. Listen to the first episode called Another Arrow in Your Dispute Resolution Quiver. Now, in the second episode, Fido and Kitty, when public and private venues square off, our guests will discuss a very hotbed arena where a myriad of conflicts continually arise involving the access of service animals in our society. So this will be a two-parter, so we will continue our conversation on this very same subject next Tuesday on the 28th. So our returning guest is Debra Voda Hamilton, and she is the principal of Hamilton Law and Mediation. Debra provides an alternative means of resolving conflict and disagreements between breeders and owners, handlers, neighbors over barking dogs, divorcing couples arranging pet custody agreements, even vets with their clients, condo co-op, tenant, and management. So there's a wide variety of areas that she works in here. Her mediation practice provides a neutral ground on which to have the conversation you want to have while peacefully coexisting. She helps her clients be heard at the time of the conflict and into the future. She works with everyone who wants to further their passion in the care of pets while reducing their exposure to conflict and litigation. You can find her website at www.hamiltonlawandmediation.com, and we'll repeat that again later. Also, our returning guest, Gary Norman, is an attorney licensed in Ohio, Maryland, and before the United States Supreme Court. He seeks to leverage alternative dispute resolution tools to resolve conflicts. In his many adventures about town, where he's often the sole or even the first guide dog team in the room, his able second guide dog pilot is present with them, reflecting the uniqueness of having a disability. Now, as a lawyer who specializes in the full range of ADR tools, including litigation when necessary, he believes that animals may play a leading role both at a mediation table and in the courtroom. While he is not doing all of this, he may be found caring for his two dogs, a retired and an active guide dog, or reading one of his myriad books from the Library for the Blind. Gary Norman's article, Dispute Thy Neighbor, Hire a Mediator, was recently published in the Virginia Maryland Dog Magazine. His website is www.gnormanlaw.com. Again, we'll repeat those websites a little bit later. Now, tonight we are not taking live caller questions and comments, but we will be taking them in the chat room. If you'd like to post there, you just simply go to blogtalkradio.com. and then you use the / and then Texas, TEXAS, -conflict -coach. You'll scroll down to our show page, which is When Pets, People, and Places Collide. You'll see the show. And just scroll down, you'll see the chat room is open right now. And we appreciate the guests who are there listening in already. We also invite you to join our Twitter feed. We're using the hashtag right now, capital T, capital C, capital C for Texas Conflict Coach, and then capital RADIO. I don't think the capital I really matters, but it's TCC Radio is the hashtag. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Gary and Debra, welcome back to the program.
It's great to be here, Patty. Thanks so much for having us back.
I am once again delighted to be with all of you and look forward to this conversation this evening. A snowy day here in Baltimore, Maryland.
Yes, I've heard about the snowy weather up on the East Coast. While we'll send some warmth your way from Texas here.
Thanks so much. It's been pretty cold.
Well, we're going to continue our discussion by talking about the conflict that arises with companion and service animals. And first, I think it would be helpful to listeners to understand the difference among the terms, because I've heard myself service animals, assistance animals, guide dogs, companion animals, therapy animals. There's so many terms out there. Can you kind of clarify some of these terms for us?
Sure, and Deborah can jump in at any time or interject at any time, but there are many different terms or terminology or phrases. And some of them are more colloquial in nature, but some do also have specific legal impact. Assistance dogs or service animals are common terms that the public and our great listeners might hear. Those are pretty interchangeable and common under ADA law. On the other hand, there is also the term assistive animal, which is the similar kind of concept, but a specific legal type of nomenclature found in fair housing law. And then assistance dogs or service animals is a term that will be found in issues involving, say, aircraft or air carriers when people are traveling with their dogs on airplanes. Companion animals, or the other term that perhaps all of us know, pets, is yet another term, not specific per se to people with disabilities, but yet another term that we find in animal law. And it's kind of a term that's evolved because the animal law field recognizes animals as having more status than just, say, a toaster or a car. Companion animals connotes a certain kind of view about animals and their relationship to us as humans, and some even say human guardians or custodians.
So what do you commonly refer to Pilot? I mean, he's your guide dog, is that right? Is that what you commonly refer to him as?
I think certainly we'll get into the legal specificities, but I refer to Pilot as a guide dog, and a guide dog is one kind or one subset of service animals or assistance dogs.
Okay, very good. Okay, very good. Thank you for clarifying that. Now, in our first episode, we talked about how mediation is used to help people have difficult conversations and move through conflict. And that's for people who've been listening to this program for many years now. Mediation is used in many contexts, but in our episode about the animals, mediation is certainly used about that. So how may companion or service animals actually help parties in these mediation sessions, meaning they're actually in the mediation session, right?
Absolutely. Before I provide my comments, I thought I heard Deborah wanting to say something.
No, I'm good. I just wanted to add that another kind of dog that we should just acknowledge, it doesn't fall under any sort of specificity, but is the pet therapy dog. And those kinds of dogs would be in service during a court service or any sort of emotional distress. They're trained dogs to help people get over or to work through different difficulties. They've been used at colleges and law schools and in courts to help people testify or relive a certain situation or get through law school finals.
Absolutely correct. I will probably attempt to string somewhat the legal specificities of service animals or assistance dogs or assistance animals for that fact, hopefully through both of our conversations, because it's such a rich bed of concerns and issues and access. That being said, I think it's important to quickly note what Deborah just said, because emotional support or therapy dogs have a lot of legal significance connected with them. Under ADA law, an emotional support dog, because according to the DOJ, may not provide a specific task, would not fall under the definition of service animal or assistance dog, whereas under Fair Housing Law or the Fair Housing Amendments Act, or under the laws regarding access of people with disabilities to air travel, which is a different type of statutory scheme than the ADA, emotional support dogs would also be allowed with their handlers on airlines, of course, as long as they're not causing a disruption.
So who knew there was so much complexity when we talk about the use of service and assistance animals, pet therapy, and where do they fall under? Now, you mentioned the word DOJ, or the acronym DOJ. Most listeners might not know what that is, but I believe you're referring to the Department of Justice.
Sure, Department of Justice. They updated what's called the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 as amended regulations, and those became into effect in March 2011. They addressed a range of issues. Naturally, there's a range of issues as people with disabilities become more visible in society, everything from access to stadiums to access to taxis or restaurants. And certainly service animals or puppy dogs like my guide dog Pilot are part of that conversation and sometimes part of conflicts that arise because of the gap, like we talked about last time, between the law or the law in the books and day-to-day practice.
So I want to come back to that in just a moment regarding some of the U.S. laws and give us a simple overview, because those can be very complex. I want to go back to the other question I was asking, which is, in our connection to the use of ADR tools and processes that folks can actually, whether it's under the ADA or some other component, that you will often or can see companion or service animals or pet therapy dogs in these types of conflict resolution or specifically mediation sessions. Is that correct, and how is that helpful?
I do believe that's correct. So a service animal could arise in an ADR situation or at an ADR table in one of two ways. Naturally, it could be matched with a person with a disability, such as myself, being part of the conflict where somebody has perhaps attempted to deny Pilot and me access to, say, a restaurant or a taxi. Or as an attorney mediator, I often have Pilot in the ADR room with me. As I mentioned in the Dog Magazine article, I find, and Debra would support me on this, that guide dogs or Pilot, other animals, can be a real tool and a real asset to the mediation process. Dogs, as Debra mentioned, as I quoted in my article, bring out perhaps, hopefully, the best spirits of our natures. And by having an animal such as a visible guide dog like Pilot in the room, sometimes that brings out the best in the parties and sometimes ratchets down their physical or biological responses to conflict, but also hopefully nudges them to tie into their better spirits, as Lincoln said, and try to get to a settlement instead of trying to be entrenched in ideology or past behaviors.
In my practice, it is imperative to have pets present in my office because it lowers the temperature, as Gary said, it really lowers the temperature of the conflict because people have that tactile or have that personal expression. And I always ask my clients whether or not they want pets in the room. It isn't appropriate when there is a pet, non-pet conflict that we're dealing with because one of the parties really don't like pets, and I would never put that in the situation. However, when it's people arguing over their own pet, I don't necessarily want them to bring their pet to the conflict, but I happen to have big and small pets, so they can pick the one they want and have it help them really work through their disagreements. It's been very effective, and since I am a conflict mediator of conflicts between people about pets, it's good that I have pets.
So I want to clarify with listeners two things that I think I'm hearing. One is you, like Gary, because you use a guide dog for yourself and you yourself are a mediator, you are a practitioner, you obviously, with a person with a disability protected under the ADA, will bring your dog into the mediation. It's not necessarily for the parties' benefit. It's really there for your benefit as a person with a disability. And then and for that matter, any person with a disability who might go into like a mediation setting who will bring in either a service or assistance animal. And then, Debra, I'm hearing you say that you will use pets as kind of an emotional support, a therapeutic element in some of these conversations. So I'm seeing there's a variety of ways in which that can be used.
And Patty, I think Gary will bear this out. I have to say that just having Pilot in the room may, in fact, have the same effect as having my dogs in the room because it's just that I want to say a pheromone, but it probably isn't. It's just that feeling, especially if the argument is between people over a pet they love. Having an animal there keeps them centered in reality testing about where they should go and what they should discuss.
That's what I wanted to add to what you said, Patty. All of what you said is correct, except I would amplify it to note that pilot is also an asset to the mediation table or to the mediation process.
Okay, very good. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Now, let's go back to, Gary, something you were saying about some of the U.S. laws, such as the Americans with Disability Act, the Fair Housing Act. You were talking about, the airlines. There's a number of them, and we certainly don't have time to go into depth. They're very complex. Can you give us, with people with disabilities who do use assistance or service animals, what are some of the typical conflicts that arise involving these types of animals? And as you talk about it, feel free to decide whether you want us to kind of give us a quick overview of these laws or if you want to go right into the typical conflicts, whatever makes sense for you.
So I think just the understanding of what is a service animal or even an assistance animal in the case of fair housing can be a cause of conflict itself. So it may be helpful just to give a quick and dirty, as it were, description of what the laws are trying to get at in a way that I think is non-legalistic. To use one of your words, normalize, or to use what I feel more comfortable with to try to clarify the law. Basically, the three laws are trying to get at how do we take a very special creature and match it with a person with a disability to make sure that their disability is addressed and that they can be more included. The various laws that I mentioned come about this issue in different ways. The ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act, is based on the concept of the public space, a restaurant, a taxi, a bar, a hotel, a place of lodging. Fair housing naturally addresses a private dwelling, my house, my beautiful old row home that's 100 years old, your house in Texas, Debra's house in New York, a landlord's space in Baltimore. The Air Carrier Access Act, which is the statutory scheme that addresses aircraft, addresses U.S. Air, Southwest. Perhaps airports, but not necessarily. Actually, there's a conflict in laws between the Americans with Disabilities Act and Air Carrier Access in that way. The ADA might apply where the statutory scheme for airlines might not, because when you're in the airport, it's actually a place of public accommodation. It's a little bit different than when you're on the airplane itself. Each of those has a different sense of how you take that animal and make it into a working animal for a person with a disability. The ADA really basically wants to seek a dog or even a cat that does a very specific task that addresses a disability, and there has to be a nexus between that animal, and it can only be dogs or cats, and in some very rare circumstances, miniature horses, and the impairment that limits the life function. Fair housing, on the other hand, doesn't really look so strictly to a specific task. It says under the law that the animal has to perform work or perform tasks. Even emotional support dogs can do that. It doesn't restrict them the way that the ADA does, and for natural reasons. In the public space, you want to try to be more careful about the kinds of dogs or cats that are matched with people with disabilities, whereas in a private dwelling, we all know that even our pets really improve our mental health. And so there is that difference. Under the air travel law that I mentioned, they also take a broader view of emotional support or therapy animals. And rightfully so, because people might be trying to train different therapy dogs or taking them to help others. The Air Carrier Access Act, as Rebecca Huss mentioned in a very good law review article from 2010, does a good job at trying to balance a broader definition of service animals while also imposing some reasonable restrictions. It says that an airline can request a person with an emotional support or therapy dog to have a letter from their doctor saying that this is an emotional support dog, and the airline can also ask for advance notice, all pretty seemingly reasonable by my view. So I hope that explains some of the legal definition. And, yes, conflicts do arise because of that and just access issues themselves. I can mention at least one example of access issues that even I, as a civil rights commissioner, encounter on a regular basis, I would say. Sometimes they're larger access denials, such as a restaurant in Baltimore at a five-star hotel said, we don't think your guide dog can come in here. And of course, being with my in-laws at the time, I said, yes, I can. And then I try to do my very best to explain how them mistreating me that way was really a denial of good customer service, especially in front of my in-laws. It can be a smaller kind of access where people just sometimes don't understand how to interact with a guide dog, and hopefully all of us know this. Sometimes they don't. They try to interfere or they try to pet pilot, which can be disruptive depending on the situation.
And I think to add to that, Patty, it would be interesting that Gary has a conversation. He doesn't get angry initially. He probably feels some sort of disagreement, but he doesn't get into a conflict, and that's the piece that we're trying to express here in these next two half-hour segments, is that there's a way to have the conversation both as the person who is confronted by someone with a service animal and the person with the service animal.
Or at least I can say I've done my very best to try to evolve, not to make it adversarial and conflictual. I'm evolving in this way all the time to be a better handler and to be a better mediator, even in these soft kind of on-the-spot moments.
Exactly. All right, so we're going to come back to some recommendations about how we handle these types of situations, whether we're the person with a disability or whether we're the person being, having encountered that. Before we do that, you are tuned in to the Texas Conflict Coach Blog Talk radio program, and I'm talking with Gary Norman and Debra Hamilton, both attorneys and both ADR practitioners, meaning they mediate cases involving animals, animal-related disputes. And in our first part of a two-part series called Fido and Kitty, When Public and Private Venues Square Off, we're specifically focused on issues that involve access of service animals in our communities and in our societies. And Gary was just mentioning that his guide dog named Piley gave an example of, a service establishment, a restaurant, I believe, in this case, with his in-laws, and the person on the receiving end didn't know how to handle it or didn't even know that they could even bring in the guide dog in. Now, we have a number of people who are in our chat room, in our studio, and we have some Twitter feed going. So if you're in the chat room, feel free to post your comments, or if you have a question in the chat room, I can bring that into the show. We are not taking live caller comments, so we appreciate you being in the studio tonight. And again, we're using the hashtag TCC Radio on Twitter. So if you're on Twitter and you want to engage us that way, you can do that as well. So Debra and Gary, so then how do you, and maybe we start with you, Gary, because in your situation, you're trying to utilize your own mediation skills, just, being conflict competent when you're encountering these situations. How would you recommend people handle these types of situations that they're carrying in the public space?
I'm continuing to evolve, like I said, in this way, and I'm trying to bring, as we talked about last time, some of my studies of alternative health to the situation, because by being more reflective and less reactive, this can ratchet down the situation and perhaps lead to more quick and better resolutions on the spot, which is really the case of how these kinds of situations are best resolved, because they're in-the-moment conflicts that don't always lend themselves to a formal legal complaint, and even if a formal legal complaint is filed with an entity like the Department of Justice, often relief is slow in the coming, unfortunately. And so it's better to build a relationship with an establishment, hopefully preemptively, but if a conflict does arise, then to leverage that situation to make both the individual case, such as myself a pilot, and then also the broader case of all who might come after me, hopefully also very good guide dog handlers, can have a positive experience.
So it seems that people, like the example that you gave, especially like in restaurants, these public places, coffee houses, are just they're ignorant about what the law is and what is allowable. It sounds like that a lot of those kinds of situations is because that they don't know what that means and how to handle that. Is that right, or is there something else that's motivating the conflict with these folks?
I think that's the best positive spin. Yes, people are still, and shockingly so, unaware of the various kinds of laws, and perhaps by the complexity of those laws themselves.
All right. Now, what can be confusing, though, is You know, most people, I think, nowadays, especially in the United States, I don't know how it is in other countries. We have listeners who listen from all over the world. You know, I see a guide dog, most people automatically know that they're allowed in public places. But it's those things that are a little unclear when you see other animals and they're like, well, they're a pet therapy, or maybe they're a cat. And there's some other type of a service or assistance animal, but they're not a guide dog. And so that can get a little unclear, and I imagine, be a very common issue that comes up.
Well, I agree that may be a point of conflict, and Debra wanted to stress that, as do I. The law, especially the civil rights law for people with disabilities matched with or partnered with service animals, is somewhat based on public acceptance. So when we have a slew of dogs or cats that are not specifically trained or cannot provide a very specific task, or in the fair housing setting can really help their handlers to be more healthy, then that really deteriorates the acceptance of the law over time. As such, Debra and myself have some great concerns about kind of sham service animals. And I think Debra wanted to mention or note that.
Right. I just wrote an article for a magazine that I write for, Canine Chronicle, and explained to people in, say, the dog show world who slap a service dog vest on a dog so they don't have to fly to Westminster or to the Eukanuba down in Florida or to the National Dog Show in Pennsylvania that everyone watches at Thanksgiving. And we all are worried about flying our dogs all over the country in cargo. But to misuse the service dog status is really causing an issue for the people who really need their service dogs, because they're the ones who then are questioned, as Gary pointed out, quite vigorously, because people don't know whether to believe them or not.
So do you have additional recommendations, Debra, about how people handle these types of situations they encounter in public, again, whether they're the person with the service animal or the person who is unaware and, confronts that situation?
Well, I guess Gary and I have spoken about this at length, and I think the most important piece is not to assume that the person is not using the dog in error, especially with all of our service people coming back with PTSD. They truly need these dogs and look perfectly normal, thankfully, because the dog is next to them, but they really do need it, so you may question it. Don't assume that someone's misusing it, and if you really do want to inquire, do it in a way that is not confrontational if you can, and if it becomes confrontational, absolutely just listen to the person and don't engage in a difficult conversation, because quite frankly it's a no-win situation for either side. So you really need to have a conversation that's more respectful, because you don't know what the story is. What do you think, Gary?
I think that's correct. They might say something like, or to the effect of, I observe you have an animal partnered with you. That's a great relationship. I think I'm allowed to ask you, do you have a disability, and is that animal helping you with your disability? I don't want to be rude or offensive. I just want to make sure that I'm providing the best customer service to you and all of my patrons in this particular venue.
And hopefully they won't get insulted if you ask them, because unfortunately a lot of people read, and I think Gary will bear this out, read ADA as black and white. So they don't necessarily have to tell you what their disability is. However, I think the way Gary put it, which is, you don't have to tell me your disability, what can I do to make your stay or your passage easier, that would be a way to really accommodate someone who needs the service dog and possibly make the person who doesn't need the service dog hopefully feel really bad that they're misusing the wonderful gift that they've been given by the United States.
Well, we're definitely going to, this is a very rich conversation. It's a very huge area, complex, not only in its laws, but in all the many examples of where conflict comes up, either in a public space, as you mentioned, restaurants, hotels, library, whatever that might be, even in the airports. It's interesting, by the way, late last fall in the San Antonio airport, they actually had started a pet therapy program at the airport as a way to calm passengers in the boarding areas. I don't know if you heard about that.
I have.
Yes, and so they had it on the news and everything. I thought that was pretty amazing that they saw value. And these are trained, you know, they have insurance, they're trained, they're certified as therapy animals, and used in the boarding gate areas as a way to calm passengers. So we are going to continue this conversation in our second part of the episode. So we're by no means finished with this topic. So I encourage all of those who have been in the chat room, in the studio, and the Twitter feed to definitely come back next Tuesday evening, same time, same exact time, same guest, and we'll continue our conversation with this. So, Gary, as we begin to close this, and Debra, do you have an assignment for the week or a call to action that you want to give guests between now and then that they can be doing?
I do, and this is an ongoing assignment to use for better and more glorious purposes than does the Department of Homeland Security. I would give your audience and our many friends on the chat room and on Twitter the words, see something, say something. If they observe an access denial, such as Pilot and me at Union Station, and a taxi is giving us somewhat of a hard time, speak up. Say that the law gives Gary Norman or other attorneys with disabilities who are partnered with great dogs like Pilot certain access rights, and you shouldn't be treating them just even as customer service in that way. Guide dogs are clearly allowed in taxis. They're clearly allowed in public spaces.
And
okay, so see something, say something. Go ahead, Debra.
Absolutely, and to add to that, recognize that if in fact someone takes offense to your saying something that you've seen that you want to address, recognize that the way you respond will be the tenor of the discussion, and remember, it is always better to be peaceful than to be confrontational. So try to respond in a peaceful manner.
That's absolutely correct. And the kind of annual Civil Rights Weekend here in the United States, Dr. King Weekend, that celebrates all the efforts of the civil rights struggle of African Americans, and also Indians people from India who came before him with Gandhi. We know the power of nonviolent demonstration and nonviolent resistance to bad things, the evil discrimination.
Very, very good. Okay, so very good. Respond peacefully, see something, say something. That's an ongoing assignment that we're giving you listeners. Now, you can find Gary Norman at gnorman, Norman, law.com. You can find Deborah Hamilton at Hamilton, that's Hamilton, lawandmediation.com. So that's Hamilton lawandmediation.com. All of their information are on the show pages, not only on blogtalkradio.com, but at texasconflictcoach.com. And that's Texas all spelled out. What final message do each of you want to leave with the listeners?
I guess I would say that I'm so very blessed to be partnered with a guide dog, Pilot, and my former dog, Langer. They have been both assets in my life in the mediation process at the mediation table, and they've even been, unfortunately, sometimes part of conflicts. But either way, they've been a rich source of conversation and a rich part of my legal career and ADR career.
And for me, I would leave the audience with the thought that animals are a huge part of our lives. And if you can live with them peacefully, if you can take a step back and hear the other person regarding your animal, or when you are discussing someone else's animal with them, take a step back and listen, because it could provide you with a result that you may not reach if you continue to be in conflict.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Debra and Gary, for being back for our part 2 of our 3-part series, When Pets, People, and Places Collide. Now, again, we'll be returning next Tuesday, the 28th, with Gary and Debra, and we thank you for all joining us tonight.
Thank you for listening to the Texas Conflict Coach. We hope you've enjoyed the program. You can find over 300 podcasts archived to listen at your own convenience at texasconflictcoach.com, or download the podcast at iTunes or Stitcher Radio. To learn about upcoming radio programs and resources, sign up for our monthly e-newsletter.